Hello again. This is Taylor from Singapore Green New Deal, and I'm here to respond to your questions about climate change. For the sources to the information that we cover in this video, check out the links in the description. In the last video, we talked about the engineering solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And what we learned is that in order to implement these solutions, we need to come up with the money to pay for them. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to look at the response internationally, as well as in Singapore, on the government policy responses to climate change. Are leaders doing enough to prevent global warming? For example, some countries don't seem to care very much. The current state of global affairs, according to the latest UN emissions gap report from 2019, is that globally, we're off track. We're headed towards a 3 degrees Celsius warming under current policies, and that's what we mean by business as usual. 3 degrees Celsius is catastrophic. To close that gap, we need to further reduce the rate of greenhouse gas emissions by 22 gigatons per year. That's a lot. So how do we compare countries to one another for whether they're doing their part? There is no single one way to measure. Probably the most objective way is their pledge to the Paris Agreement or their Nationally Declared Contribution, or NDC. The recommendation by the scientists, the IPCC, is net zero by 2050 and a 45% reduction by 2030 globally, and even higher for advanced economies. This is a hard target that countries set for themselves, and it's up to that country to figure out how they're going to hit that target. Then, the next step is to figure out a detailed policy analysis to try to figure out whether they have policies in place that is likely going to hit that target. That's where Climate Action Tracker comes in. That's what they do. They analyze and predict based on the policies that they set whether they're going to hit their targets or not. For me, something that I feel is a fairly representative assessment of whether they're going to hit their target is how much money they're spending. And this can vary. It can vary for different situations for different countries, but a general heuristic is around 1 to 2% of GDP. That's at least a ballpark figure, just as a quick estimate.
We also know that transforming the American electrical sector to produce power without producing carbon pollution and electrifying an increased share of our economy will be the greatest spurring of job creation and economic competitiveness in the 21st century.
That was presidential candidate from the United States, Joe Biden, the rival to current President Donald J. Trump. While the emissions gap report is still representative of current policies in place since 2019 until now in 2020, there have still been signs that those policies could change. The good news is that not all the countries are neglecting responsibilities or free riding to the same degree, and some have been taking their pledges seriously, such as the Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway, which have been in the lead along with the UK, which passed the Climate Change Act in 2008. So for some time now, they have been ambitious about climate change. And just this year in 2020, we have seen some direction changes from those advanced economies that previously were resistant to more ambition. This year in 2020, countries have stepped up their policy ambition, such as South Korea, which in April announced a $138 billion K-New Deal, which includes a Green New Deal component as well as a digital. And in March, the EU announced the Green Deal, a $1.2 trillion economic investment and stimulus program. And in September, China gave us a surprise by committing to a pledge to reduce to net zero emissions by 2060, which would be a very big game changer in terms of the overall global emissions reduction. And the new presidential candidate, Joe Biden, is promoting a $2 trillion climate change, jobs, stimulus, and economic stimulus plan. Southeast Asia, unfortunately, is one of the furthest behind on climate change, along with the oil-producing nations that are dependent on fossil fuels for their economy. Unlike other parts of the world, ASEAN nations still include plans for large amounts of coal production, which is the worst for air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're talking about Singapore, unfortunately, even within ASEAN, Singapore is one of the highest emitters per capita.
For us, climate change is existential. Singapore contributes only 0.11% of global emissions. Nevertheless, we have played our part as responsible global citizens to mitigate climate change. We pledged in Paris to peak our carbon emissions in around 2030. We are switching to a cleaner fuel mix and deploying cleaner energy solutions. Being small and highly urbanized, we are disadvantaged in terms of alternative energy options. But we are developing creative solutions within our constraints. For example, we are using solar energy to the maximum extent possible and installing large-scale solar panels that float in our reservoirs and off our shorelines in the sea. We also implemented a carbon tax this year with the intention of increasing it over the next 10 years. And we are greening our physical and transport infrastructure. We're aiming for 80% of our buildings in Singapore to be green by 2030, and for 90% of peak hour commuting trips to be via public transport, active mobility, or shared transport by 2040. We are also developing our long-term low emissions development strategy as called for under the Paris Agreement. Singapore will do our full part, but however hard we try, Singapore will not be able to stop climate change on our own. Therefore, we are cooperating with other countries in this common endeavor. We launched the Climate Action Package to offer capacity building programs. We have contributed $5 million to the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, based in Singapore, for a 5-year regional capacity development program for Southeast Asia. And we've established the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility with the support of Japan and the World Bank to provide flood risk pooling for the region. Climate change is the ultimate global commons challenge. As leaders, we all have the responsibility to do our part to rally our people's support for sustainable development, to convince and educate our people that these efforts are important, and to safeguard our future and the futures of our children and grandchildren. I therefore call upon my fellow member states to redouble our efforts both to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. Thank you.
So, what is Singapore doing? There are a few noteworthy areas of forward ambition. As a developed country, Singapore is nowhere near what is needed. We're essentially business as usual. Now, you may have heard some people say, but Singapore contributes only 0.11% of global emissions. While that may be true for emissions inside Singapore's borders, it doesn't include emissions from activity beyond our borders that we are responsible for financing from our economic activity. When added together, that amounts to 2 to 3 times the territorial emissions. Also, 0.11% for a city of only 0.07% of the world's population, 5.6 million people, is a lot. When we compare ourselves to other cities, Singapore is right at the top of the list as one of the worst carbon polluting cities in the world at 30 tons of carbon emissions per person. Yikes. But what you might not know is that not all of Singaporeans are responsible for that 30 tons. Most Heartlanders, in fact, have a low footprint closer to the average urban citizen around the world. So where are all of those emissions coming from? Petrochemicals comes right to the top at 45%. 3 companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, and PCS. When we add it all up, we see that Singapore is far above the recommended 1 ton per capita at 8 tons per capita, also well above the ASEAN average of 2 tons per capita. So in order to meet the emissions reduction targets to limit global warming to less than 1.5 Celsius, advanced economies like Singapore need to peak emissions as soon as possible, reach net zero emissions by 2050, and 45 to 55% reduction in the next 10 years by 2030. Singapore is not only reluctant to reduce by that level of amount, but they are actually officially planning to increase emissions to 65 million tons per year at a time when we should be reducing emissions. There are a number of organizations which have given their independent assessment of Singapore government's climate change performance. Climate Action Tracker goes in depth to each policy and simulates how the policies are expected to impact emissions. They have profiles for a number of advanced economies around the world where sufficient data is available, and they have a country profile for Singapore. Locally, you can also see how Singapore Climate Rally scored the government on climate change policy. And you should take a look at the public submissions from citizens, which is available on the NCCS website. You can also check out what's published on the Green New Deal, where you can find the links and resources in the video description. Singapore policies, in terms of their emissions reduction pledges relative to their wealth, for the moment looks closer to the OPEC countries, which is unfortunate. Here are a few highlights. The top 4 critical policy actions that would bring Singapore in line with an economic solution that would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and in a way that improves Singaporean lives would be: first, to set scientific targets for their pledges to align with the Paris Agreement, net zero by 2050. Second, to retire GDP as a national measure of success. Third, to raise the cost of carbon pollution that's coming from industry to the level that's recommended by international organizations and economists such as the IMF to $100 a ton by 2030, and to commit to a budget for financing the decarbonization that is in line with what economists project of around 1 to 2% of GDP over 20-30 years. Number 4, to downsize the petrochemicals industry in a way that is just for workers, such as deploying them to alternative employment and covering their transition expenses. While Singapore citizens' feedback from public consultation has been fairly consistent in supporting these top 4 measures, the Singapore government, as of now, opposes all of them. There are a few noteworthy positive things that Singapore is doing proactively. It's not all bad. In particular, 4 areas: restriction on private vehicles, road transport, as well as the conversion to electric vehicles. Number 2, building energy efficiency subsidization and incentives. Number 3, domestic solar PV deployment, particularly in floating solar. And number 4 is research and development in the low carbon alternatives and these others. In particular, the public transportation and private vehicle performance is noteworthy, and this is one area where Singapore stands out among its peers. The government has pledged to phase out the internal combustion engine by 2040. So how did the pandemic affect efforts to combat climate change? In general, while the direct effects were a bit modest, indirect effects in the long term may end up being substantial. In particular, there are 3 impacts that the COVID has had on climate change. The direct effects, as I said, were modest, negligible in the long run. It was relatively short-lived. A 5% reduction in 1 year out of a 100-year time period is not going to show up hardly at all. However, the potential permanent restructuring of the consumption patterns may have some impact on travel patterns, although we won't really know just how much that has on the total lifestyle and carbon footprint. But probably the most significant impact is the breakdown of the economy, public awareness of the need for a shift for governments to take a more direct role in the economic recovery. So long as private shareholders-controlled corporations are in control of making decisions about the economy, it may be difficult to achieve the pace of change that's required by scientists. Due to the nature of the pandemic, private corporations are in a position where they are unable and unwilling to spend the money to employ the same level of people as pre-pandemic. This is important because governments are the ones in the best position to fund public infrastructure and projects that are necessary for the energy transformation. So the economic recovery is a good opportunity to spend public money for these kinds of public rather than private investments and creating jobs while doing so. This is the basis for the US presidential candidate Joe Biden's economic recovery plan, and it's also the basis for international institutions like the IMF guidance for economic recovery packages. In other words, COVID-19 just makes the case for the Green New Deal even more compelling. Unfortunately, that doesn't appear to be how Singapore is currently approaching the situation. Singapore has not communicated that they intend to include a commensurately large spending on funding energy transition infrastructure as part of their post-pandemic economic recovery plan. Question 4. Is it true that a majority of climate change is caused by industries and businesses? Yes, that's where the emissions are coming from. 70% of global emissions can be traced to 100 companies. And in Singapore, 45% can be attributed to the 3 oil and gas companies. Only less than 20% of emissions can be directly attributed to decisions by households. The rest are decisions made by commercial and industrial businesses. Now, cause is a contentious word. Some may argue that a purpose for a business to exist is only to provide a service to customers. So maybe ultimately, according to some, it's the customers who are responsible for all the business activities. Now, I'll let you grapple with this idea on your own time, but let's just say not everyone agrees with that way of looking at things. Another way of looking at corporations is that they exist to provide a profit to shareholders. So if you've ever worked for a company, you may have heard someone say, this is no charity. So no matter whether it's the shareholders or the customers who bear the responsibility, ultimately, that is where the emissions is coming from. I will leave it to you to decide whether governments, shareholders, concerned citizens like you, the employees, or the customers should be the ones that are responsible for changing the behavior of that corporation. Now, if you'd like to hear more, you can feel free to drop me an email, and I have more to say about this, but for now, let's just leave it as something of thought for you to consider. The next question: why is Singapore working on adapting the effects of climate change instead of combating it? Good question. Question number 6. What is taking Singapore so long to mass produce electric vehicles? Another excellent question.
Thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something about the international and Singapore government policy response to climate change. If you have any questions about climate change or would like to hear more about how to get involved, have a look at the Green New Deal website that has a list of the local organizations working on climate change. There's a link in the description. If you'd like to hear more about Singapore Green New Deal or would like to know about how to get involved, do check out the Singapore Green New Deal website and /get involved. And you can also follow on Twitter or join the conversation in our Facebook group. See you around next time.